My name is Peter Rowan. I've been an entrepreneur pretty much my whole life in a whole number of capacities. I started my first business in high school. It was a house painting business, had a window washing company, property management, paid my way through college a little bit through that. Actually, my parents paid for college. That paid more for food, beer, things like that. Yeah. I worked in the former Soviet Union between college and graduate school. Got a little bit of a taste for entrepreneurship there. I went to business school. And then I worked for a private equity firm in New York that was investing in startups. It was odd in that we were investing in technology in Russia mostly. During that time, it was the 90s when the internet first came up, so we got interested in that. And we started investing in internet companies in New York. And that's where I'm from. And so I went to work for one of the portfolio companies, at first as their CFO and then ultimately as their president. And so it was an internet application development company called T3 Media. And so I ran that for a few years, kind of right around the meltdown of the internet, but we sold the business in 2000. I moved to Seattle, where my wife is from, and got involved in some entrepreneurial things. And then I took this job with this really boring company that turns coins into cash called Coinstar. And it turned out to be the greatest job you could ever have. So I was the head of new ventures. So my job was really to figure out what else that they could do than this coin counting business, which was pretty good. And it was kind of a small niche business that they pretty much owned. They were a public company and there was a lot of pressure to grow. And so because I'd had some experience with entrepreneurship and some experience with corporate finance and some experience with sort of innovation, product development, they kind of let me do all those things. So I spent nearly 10 years there. And during that time, we invested in about 30 different businesses, some of which we started from scratch inside in kind of an incubator, a captive incubator, some of which we acquired or invested in. And so, like all good private equity or venture capital portfolios, they consist of a whole lot of things that don't work, that fail miserably, some which are okay, and a few, hopefully, one, that get really big enough to pay for everything else. And that's kind of my story. So we owned several different electronic payments businesses that worked out pretty well. A lot of newfangled kiosks, because we were a kiosk company that were pretty embarrassing failures in hindsight. Now I can tell you about some of those. And
would you?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, sure. Well, and then the one that at the time seemed like a really good idea and now kind of seems like a dumb idea, which was the big success, was called Redbox. So we started Redbox in 2005, and by 2010, when I left, it had about $1 billion in revenue. So it was a pretty fast growth company. And then now, of course, when you look back, more than 10 years later, you think, wait, why would you want to be in the DVD rental business? But yeah. So, most of my experience has been in starting things that end up not working out, actually. But, I'm a firm believer that you have to fail in order to succeed. So I'm good at failing. We actually started a company called DVD Express. We started a business called DVD Express, and we looked at some things that were going on in Europe at the time. So really, it was a clone market strategy. There were kiosks, there were self-service DVD rental kiosks in Europe, and we were trying to figure out how else we could leverage our strengths in the front of these retail stores, and how we could also become more important to these retail partners, because even though our customers really liked the Coinstar machine, they didn't use it all that frequently because it takes time to accumulate coins. And so it represented a pretty small part of the ecosystem for a grocery retailer. So if they do $500,000 a week in sales, They were just getting, a few bucks off of us, and so we weren't very important. So we wanted to be more important. We wanted to help them drive people into the stores. We wanted to drive more profit to them. So our goal was to look at all the different things that we could automate across the front of the store. And the DVD business was pretty interesting because just down the street from most grocery stores, there was a Blockbuster, and that had maybe $1 million in revenue that came out of that parking lot. But customers had to make two stops, basically, when they came, if they wanted to get a movie and then go to the grocery store. And so we thought that we could automate part of that and just offer the new release movies, which was most of the revenue in a Blockbuster anyway. And then people could come in to the stores and get their groceries, get their milk and eggs, and then rent a movie on the way out for a value that was such a great deal that it didn't really matter. It would almost become an impulse purchase. So that was called DVD Express. We actually did some of our first pilots here in Hawaii at Foodland. And then at the same time, a guy that I knew from my venture capital days in New York was actually working for McDonald's in their innovation group. And they had started a business that was a self-service convenience store. If you think of, say, a 7-Eleven, it was everything you sell in a 7-Eleven in a completely automated self-service kiosk, this huge thing. They were testing that. And it didn't work very well because in the convenience store channel, the number one sales category is beer. And the number two was cigarettes. And neither of those you could sell out of a self-service device because of the age restrictions. And so when you took those two categories of product out of there, there wasn't really that much left. So they had this test they were doing at a McDonald's, and it wasn't working. And so Greg had the responsibility basically of shutting this thing down. He was an innovation manager there. But another guy there had been in the movie rental business, and he actually been one of the pre-IPO founders of Netflix, and his family owned a chain of traditional video rental stores. And he had gotten the idea of putting this DVD rental kiosk with the self-service convenience store. And so Greg was smart enough to look at the numbers on that and say, wait, this huge thing isn't working, let's get rid of this, but what is that over here? And so that was sort of the original pivot from this one idea, which was a self-service store, to a DVD rental, sort of one product that you'd expect to see in a convenience store maybe. And so that became Redbox. It became Redbox because the boxes were red. That's how clever it was. And then that isn't really the kind of business that McDonald's wanted to be in. And so we divested it of McDonald's and set it up as a 50-50 joint venture between McDonald's and Coinstar. And the thing that Coinstar really brought to the table is that we had pretty good access to all of the grocery retailers. McDonald's didn't have as big a company as they were. They didn't have great access to them because they competed with them for share of stomach. And so the relations were strained. And we didn't have that problem. So once we took it out of McDonald's and set it up as a standalone company, we were able to get it into Walmart, we were able to get it into Kroger stores, and then subsequently Safeway, and now I think 65,000 locations. So the great thing about that product also is that, in terms of product market fit, you could rent a movie for 99 cents. You could rent it from one machine, return it to another machine. And so it was such a great value proposition that it was sort of an immediate hit with the customers. And with the grocers, they loved it because it usually caused you to come back twice. Because if you rented it one day, you had to return it by the next day or you'd be charged more. And if you came in through the door, you'd buy something else as well, milk and eggs. So it was a pretty awesome fit for the time. And then our gamble was that we could grow that business and pay for our investment and make a return on it before what even in 2005 was obvious, which is that people wouldn't be renting DVDs forever. So it was really a gamble of how much market share we could take away from the traditional way, the old way of doing it, which was Blockbuster, before we became the old way of doing it, which is now Redbox is the old way of doing it. So, I tell my students and we tell the entrepreneurs in the accelerator how important it is to, get out of the building, that's Steve Blank's words, and talk to customers. So the founder of Coinstar, Jens Molbach, his family owned a garden center in the Seattle area, is very well known, called Molbach's in Woodinville. And he worked there as a kid, and he earned a penny a pot to wash from washing flower pots. So he always had a lot of coins. And the story is that he lugged those things around to college. He went to college on the East Coast, and then he lugged them to Wall Street, where he worked for a while. Then he lugged them back to California when he went to business school at Stanford. And while he was in business school there for his thesis project, he came up with this idea of maybe having a machine where you could dump the coins in and turn it into cash. And pretty much everybody thought it was a dumb idea. And I don't actually know whether he was influenced by the sort of lean startup methodology at the time. This would have been 1991, around 91, 92. But he and his girlfriend at the time stood in front of a Safeway in Palo Alto, and they interviewed 1,500 customers coming in and asking them questions, first to validate that they weren't the only one that had this problem. So, some people use introspection to decide whether something is a good idea or not. I hate this, or I think this would help me, and therefore I'm going to make a whole product around it. Some people are good at that, but introspection is usually a bad thing to use because you're not really like everybody else. So you don't represent necessarily the target customer all the time. So he went out and made sure that it wasn't just his problem. It seems sort of obvious that everyone would have coins, but by asking all those people if they too had a lot of change at home, he ultimately realized that there was about $10 billion in change out of circulation in the United States alone, in people's ashtrays, in their couches, in their piggy banks and things. So he got this idea, he confirmed that if he could bring this solution to the grocery stores, that this would solve a problem that wasn't only his problem, other people had it, right? And then the second part of that set of interviews was asking people whether they'd be willing to pay a fee. Because it seems sort of dumb to pay somebody to turn your money into your money, doesn't it? I think it seems like a ripoff. One of the projects I worked on when I first got there was to allow people to load their coins on a Starbucks card or on an iTunes account or an Amazon account, because I always felt like the fee was a real ripoff. You're charging people 10%. Customers would come to me and they say, "Oh, I love Coinstar. We use it to save money for our kids' college." Please don't do that, because when is it a good idea to put money in a bank account and take a 10% hit? It'll take you forever just to earn back what you originally started with. So I always encourage people to, fund their kids' college account, and then if they're going to get cash out of the machine, go buy themselves a bottle of wine or something like that, because go splurge. It's sort of like found money, So we got rid of the fee later, but I always thought the fee was a ripoff. But way back then in the early 90s, he found out that people were happy to pay that fee because they value their time more than a couple dollars an hour. And if you value your time more than $2 an hour, then it doesn't make any sense to sit there and count your pennies and roll them in and wrap them and take them to the bank, who might even charge you a fee to deposit them because they don't want them either. So 1,500 people, it doesn't matter whether the investors think it's a dumb idea or not. The customers validate that this is a real idea. It's a real example of product market fit. So then he self-financed the first machine. And then it took off from there. I have so many stories of failure. I really think I've made it a practice, made it a best practice. But I also think that anything worth doing is worth doing badly, I guess. So you could learn and improve on it. But yeah, at Coinstar, there were a couple of things where we just failed to anticipate changing trends in the market. So I think the best example I had, and it's also a cautionary tale because you have to be careful not to rely too much on surveys, on top-down market research, because it might give you the wrong impression. So in the early 2000s, we had this idea that because cell phones were starting to have cameras, and you could see that people weren't printing out pictures the way they used to when you take pictures with traditional film and you bring it into the grocery store or bring it into the photomat, have it developed, and you'd have the prints. But people were taking so many pictures with their digital cameras and with their phones, and they weren't making prints. And the reason they weren't making prints is that it was hard to make prints. They didn't have the equipment at home at that time, and the equipment was rather expensive and so forth. So we thought we could sort of replicate the old Kodak model where you'd bring your film to the grocery store and you'd order the prints, and the prints would be delivered to you. So we built this kiosk where you would take either the smart card from a phone or from a camera, or some memory device, and you put it in the kiosk, and you get thumbnails of your pictures, and you could pick the ones you wanted to have printed, and it would be uploaded overnight to a photo processing center, and then mailed to you, and you could get your prints in the mail the next day. So it was sort of a next day service for photo prints, and it actually seemed like a pretty good idea. In fact, we actually hired a firm to do a survey, and I think they surveyed 24,000 people or something like that, and they came back and said that it was the highest scoring idea that they tested with consumers, for the last 12 months or something like that. We thought, wow, we're really onto something, we should do this. One of my colleagues said, why do we even have to pilot this? If we did this survey and all these people say this is going to be a great idea, why don't we just roll it out across 10,000 locations, which would have been, I don't know, maybe $100 million or something to do that. And I thought, well, maybe we should test it just in case. So we tested it in about 25 locations. I'm not sure that we ever actually got 25 transactions out of it. It was so miserable. And there were a number of problems. One is that people don't really usually have their digital cameras with them when they go to the grocery store. So it ran into the problem we had with Coinstar, where you see it and you think, oh, that's interesting, but I got to remember to do that. I got to remember to go get that. But the bigger thing that we didn't anticipate, which seems so obvious now, is that people don't print pictures anymore. That's not, they're taking a lot more pictures than ever before, because you can. When we take pictures of food, we take pictures of, signs that we see on the wall, to help people get directions from one place to another, but we don't print those. That's not what taking pictures is for anymore, usually. And so we missed that completely, and it was a terrible failure. The only person that was really upset about it was Mrs. Scolari. Scolari's is a fantastic small chain of high-end grocery stores in Reno, Nevada. There were 15 of them, and we had a machine in all of them, and during the pilot test. And when we were shutting it down because it didn't work, we got a call from Scolari's, and they wanted us to keep it in there because Mrs. Scolari loved the machine, and she used it often. And she was most of our transactions. So unfortunately, we had to disappoint Mrs. Scolari. It's the most important thing. So I'm not wildly passionate about the uniqueness of ideas. I pretty much think that any idea that I could come up with, or you or anyone could come up with, someone somewhere else has come up with it, and they're smarter than us, and they've got more resources than, and they're further along already. And so I definitely think that the idea is the least important thing, and timing is more important than the idea. So Redbox is a good example, right? I joke all the time about, Coinstar seems like a dumb idea, Redbox seems like a dumb idea, but obviously they're not dumb because they're, huge businesses have been built off of that, and a lot of value has been created for investors and for shareholders in that company. But timing was really important. So, if the banks hadn't decided that they really didn't want coins, then Coinstar wouldn't exist, right? And the window for being in the business that Redbox is in, that was an improvement over brick and mortar video rental stores, but it was only 5 or 7 years, and they probably stayed in a little bit too long because they've been in it for about 10 years now, more than 10 years, 11 years, and it's in decline. So timing is important, more important than the idea itself. Team is by far the most important thing, because I think you can have a great idea, but a terrible team or a poor team can't pull that off. But you can have a great team and a mediocre idea, and you might make something out of it if you're smart, or a bad idea even. If you're smart, you'll find something, you'll pivot to something good. Like the Redbox story, right? Greg and Mitch Lowe was the guy who was one of the pre-IPO founding members of Netflix. They were smart enough to see that the DVD rental business, there was something in that automation solution that they could turn into something big. And so it wasn't necessarily because the DVD was such a great idea, it was because they were a great team, and they recognized that in the rubble of pretty big failed pilot, there was something really good. So I think team is the most important thing.
And just quickly, what do you think makes a good team?
Well, I think a balance of skills for sure. I mean, in the tech world, you usually want to have a balance of sort of a technical co-founder and a product visionary type of person, somebody that's that can really engage customers and see the market. So maybe more on the sales side. I think that balance has to come into play. When I was working in Russia, I worked on a lot of technology projects, and Russians are phenomenal technologists. They can solve the most complex problems, and they often do. But they value the technological problem more highly than the business part of it. And so often they're solving big hairy problems that don't really have a business in the first place, right? Or they undervalue it so much that they don't bring the right people into the team to turn it into a commercial opportunity. So that's a terrible generalization about Russian technologists, but a lot of them are like that, yeah. We definitely hire them to solve a technical problem, but you'd want to make sure that if it's going to be a business that there's somebody who really understands the market, understands the customers, and how hard that is as well. So balance, I guess, is important in a team.
That's a great answer. So what do you think the sort of pros and cons are to being an entrepreneur in Hawaii?
Well, so I've only been here for a couple of years, so maybe I still have this idealistic view of it, but I think it's an awesome place to be an entrepreneur. One of the things I tell my students here, particularly the undergraduates, they're juniors and seniors, they're graduating, like, what the heck am I going to do with my life? I have no experience. You have to be an entrepreneur, because you don't have to, it's a way of breaking that chicken and egg problem of needing experience to get a job and needing a job to have experience. And if you start something yourself, there's no interview for that. You can do it. And then even if it fails, which it probably will, the experience you got, that counts. So if you go and interview for some sleepy job at a bank, sorry banks, that experience of being an entrepreneur will count. So you've broken that, that problem with the chicken and egg problem with experience and opportunity. So how that relates to Hawaii, I've heard, haven't experienced it firsthand, that it's hard to create a career here, and a lot of people have to go to the mainland for jobs. And then it's hard to come back because of the cost of living and so forth. And it's a smaller market and the opportunities aren't as great. But if you have the entrepreneur skill set, the entrepreneur attitude, you can create your own job here, right? So it doesn't matter that there aren't that many businesses here. It doesn't matter that there aren't that many any job opportunities. So entrepreneurs create their own job. I mean, most of the things that I did entrepreneurially speaking, I started because I wanted to be somewhere or I wanted to not do something, right? So I wanted to spend the summers in Maine. And the only way I could do that was to start my own business. So I started my own business for that, you know, and that's kind of the way I look at entrepreneurship. You know, you do it because, not because you take a traditional path where, you know, you try to find a job in a new market because you want to live there, but you start something from scratch. So I think Hawaii has great opportunity for that. And then the other benefit of what we're all working on is in terms of encouraging entrepreneurs and training entrepreneurs is that it's a way for people who want to stay here, who love it here, to do that. You know, you don't have to go to the mainland to have a career. And you know, with the hope that you can come back, you can start something here. And so I think there's a real opportunity here. So as an investor, I usually look for people that I like. I have somewhat of a self-centered way of looking at investment opportunities too. I usually want to help, and so if I see you know, a group of people that I really like and they have a decent opportunity and I think that I can help in some way other than money, I'm attracted to those opportunities. There's some of it is a risk management thing as well, is that if I know something about the space they're in, then if in a downside scenario, I feel like I might be able to help fix that, right? And then in an upside scenario, sometimes I look at it and say, well, you know, can I call somebody that will help them, right, to add value to the business? And I'm a strong believer in that kind of arbitrage, right? So when I hear pitches, a lot of times I'm thinking, who can I call that can help this company, you know, get a customer or raise money or, you know, recruit a person, right? So that's usually the way I look at it. I want to see if there's a way that I can help other than money. I know everyone says that, but I usually don't invest in things that I don't understand or that I don't know something about. There's been a few, and not too many of those have worked out actually that well. Because when they got in trouble, which all companies do, because it's always up and down, all new ventures do, and they say, hey, you know, things are rough, you can't help them, except to give them more money, which usually isn't the right way to solve that particular problem. But if there's, you know, some knowledge that I can bring to the table, or somebody that I can tell them, go talk to this person because they can really help you, then I'm interested in those opportunities. That's kind of what I look for. Oh, there's so many, you know, but but I don't know the right thing to do either. So, you know, we're all just making it up as we go along usually. I think the main mistake, I would say, is not being the expert on their business. So, you know, if you're pitching to raise money, and if I'm an investor, I expect you to know everything there is to know about the space you're trying to be in. You really have to be the expert. And the worst situation you could possibly be in as an entrepreneur is to be pitching investor and have the investor, you know something about your space that you don't know about. That's a terribly discrediting thing, right? And the problem is that with Google, I can get the answer, right? So if I ask you how big a market, how big is the educational technology market? And if you don't know the answer, I can get the answer right now. It's not that hard to find that answer. So you really have to know everything about the market you're in, everything about the competitors in your space. And people also like to be dismissive of competitors or say, I don't have any competition. That's a big mistake people make. Or we really don't have any competition. This is just not true. Competition comes in all forms. It could come from inertia. It could be that your competitor is that people don't really care about what you're doing because the way they're doing it is totally fine. And so you have to solve that problem for investors. How are you going to make people care? So I also think secrecy is a mistake that people make a lot of times. They shroud their business in secrecy. They operate in stealth for some reason. Secrets are overrated, and I think life is too short for secrets. So I don't put a lot of value on protection of intellectual property. We had a portfolio of, I think, about 80 patents at Coinstar, and for all sorts of different things, different tiny little features. Some of the patents are for things that I came up with were businesses that didn't work, like the photo kiosk. I think I'm on a patent for that. and we spent a lot of money and time pursuing those patents, prosecuting those patents, and in some cases, defending our right to keep others from profiting from our technology, and it never amounted to anything of any value. So I think something like 80 or 90%, you should check my figures, of all the revenue generated off of patents filed with the US Patent Office comes from less than 2% of the patents filed. So what that tells you is that Americans are really good at coming up with ideas, really obsessed with their own right to own that, right? So they're willing to file all the patents and so forth. But they're not really that good at creating all that much value off of those patents. So I think entrepreneurs make that mistake. I get in a lot of arguments with intellectual property attorneys about that, but I rest my case. So we were talking about competitors, and there's this sort of old business school mentality of competition. Business is about competition and finding an area that you can exploit, being ahead of the competition. There's sort of a zero-sum game mentality about it. I think that's really an old model, and I think cooperation or coopetition is a much better formula. I don't like that word very much, but cooperation, I would say, is a much better formula for success. I have this pet theory that if you look at the really successful entrepreneurs who repeatedly, create successes, and there aren't that many of them, but you find that they have a much more of a collectivist, cooperative mindset than they do as an individualist, competitive mindset, which is the way Americans are known for example. So I sometimes wonder if in Hawaii might have the right ingredients culturally for success in entrepreneurialism, because I think, kind of in the bridge, I guess the midpoint of sort of Asia and America, you have a much more of a collectivist culture here. The extended family and extended support for people, and people want to help each other and so forth. I'm from New York. That's not the way it works in New York, It's much more of a zero-sum game. And so I think that part of cooperation, of collaboration, might be really good for the entrepreneurial ecosystem in Hawaii. So now that I had another sort of unpopular approach, which a lot of my students, they have these sort of shocked looks when I talk about this. So when I was looking for ideas for Coinstar, for innovation, and I look by talking to everybody. I talk to our competition on a regular basis. I had fairly good relationship with our direct competition. And that sometimes strikes people as strange. Well, why would you talk to your competitors? Well, you think about what you can learn from your competition. And I'm not talking about industrial espionage. I'm just talking about sharing, to the extent that you're sharing public information about what you're doing, right? And sometimes you find ways to work together. And so some of our biggest competitors became our partners because we realized that we were really strong in one product area and they were really strong in another product area. And so strategically, it kind of made more sense for us to focus on where we were really strong. So we could talk to a competitor and come back and say, they're really strong in that and we're not. So I'm not talking about working together. I'm not talking about any type of collusion. I'm just talking about thinking about it strategically and recognizing that they have their strengths and we have ours. And so rather than trying to beat them, we should just adjust our strategy so that we can go in a direction that has less friction. So in Hawaii, I think people are naturally good at working together. I think I'm comparing my experience. So most of my life was in New York, and then 15 years in Seattle on the West Coast, and then now a couple of years here. And I think I'm moving to an increasingly more collaborative cultures, more collectivist, where people want people to succeed. And so I think there's a great opportunity for cooperation. And I think it's a better model than the old competitive framework. So I don't even teach that anymore.